On the heels of passing a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, the Biden administration released details of a $2 trillion infrastructure initiative that would make massive investments in roads, bridges, inland waterways, rural broadband, and other key pieces of the nation's logistics and utilities grid of particular importance to agriculture. But will the nature of partisan Washington politics get in the way of good policy? What's in this bill, and can it pass with anything resembling bipartisan support? Welcome to Feedstuffs in Focus, our podcast taking a deeper look at the big issues in the livestock, poultry, grain, and feed industries. I'm your host, Andy Vance. Thanks for joining us. In this episode, we talk with Farm Progress Policy Editor Jackie Fatka about President Biden's American Jobs Plan and how the agriculture community reacted to its far-reaching proposals. She'll also discuss how farm state legislators of both parties are increasingly frustrated at the lack of bipartisanship inside the Beltway and how that might lead to yet another reconciliation bill to move the infrastructure bill forward. So, Jackie, you've been writing about this idea of infrastructure and being an important part of the Biden administration's plans and policy propositions for a while now. I was looking back through some of your columns at Farm Futures and Feedstuffs, going, clear back into the period between the election and inauguration, that we knew infrastructure was going to be an important piece of this administration's policy portfolio. So now that we have the plan out, let's start with that as the baseline. What's in the Biden administration proposal for infrastructure relative to agriculture and the feed industry, and what's it mean for us?
So usually anytime we have infrastructure, there's a lot of bipartisan support. So I think especially in some of that coverage that I had coming out, we were all very hopeful that we would have some common areas of agreement on needing investment. Obviously, coming out of the COVID environment and the need for jobs, this is coined the American Jobs Plan. And as we look at what's actually in this plan, it goes definitely beyond just infrastructure. That could be a challenging discussion and debate as we go forward. But when it comes to actual transportation, of the over $2 trillion, and that's $1 trillion that the American Jobs Plan would cost, about $621 billion would be for transportation. And there is some specific funds that would be delegated to the actual bridges and highways. Also, when they announced that, there was some specific justification that some of that would also go to smaller bridges in rural areas, which I think that's been a concern for a lot of folks. As you look at the ongoing divide between the rural and urban, the fact that they did designate some money specifically for smaller bridges, 10,000 smaller bridges of the 45,000 that are known as in poor condition, I think is important. So that's one big thing for rural communities. Obviously, even just Wednesday, when President Biden was talking further about this plan, he noted the 35% of those in rural America do not have adequate access to high-speed broadband. And I think that was something else that clearly we realized during COVID, the need for high-speed internet. And so there is $100 billion, again, $100 billion that would be set aside for developing up the high-speed broadband network. And some of the discussion point that we have heard about broadband is that it needs to be looked at very similar to how the telephone was really pushed across the country, 50, 60 years ago. And actually probably longer than that now, but the just that mentality that making sure that everybody is connected through the high-speed broadband. Those are probably the highlight items, I would say. Another big one would be $17 billion for the inland waterways system. So that is obviously important when we're talking about how to get U.S. products, ag products to our export markets or just to their end market, whether it's down the Mississippi. Obviously, waterways are a very important component of getting our products where they need to go.
You mentioned that this is something of a mixed bag, this proposal, in terms of what all's in it. And I know the president's detractors lined up pretty quickly to point out, oh gosh, there's single-digit percentage of the bill going to roads and bridges, as though that were the only part of infrastructure that mattered, roads and bridges. I do think it's important because you made the distinction about it being billion versus trillion. 6% of that bill going to roads and bridges is still $621 billion, right? Like, so it's a pretty significant amount of money. And as you noted, specifically targeting some of these highways and bridges that are in poor condition. But when you look at that bigger basket of items, what was the response from agriculture industry? Because I know a number of the policy organizations, Farm Bureau and others, have been pushing broadband as an example that you highlighted for a long time as something we need more investment in. Like, what was the reaction from the industry to the various pieces of the puzzle, from roads and bridges, inland waterways, rail, broadband, etc.?
Overall, we have really widespread support for a lot of these things. The problem is, and I think Mike Steenhoek from the Soybean Transportation Coalition probably said it best in one of his initial reactions, of the fact that once you start adding all these other things to this $2 trillion project plan that they've unveiled for us, we start to see issues that would derail support. So yes, those in the ag industry support broadband. Yes, we support funding inland waterways. Yes, we support the 115 billion for roads and bridges, 80 billion for passenger and freight rail, all these things. But then you start looking at, well, you're going to actually disincentive maybe biofuels. So the biofuels industry actually was a little concerned because there's money that's for electric vehicles and infrastructure, but they're not actually seeing this kind of middle of the road that we have to get to from now until we have more electric vehicles that's supporting the use of biofuels, which a common point that they're saying now is it's actually 46% less greenhouse gases than gasoline. So obviously that is able to be part of the climate solution. So much of this package is guised under the not just building for today, but building for tomorrow. So a lot of the focus within this plan is how to make either incentives to encourage the adoption of climate friendly things or discourage the use of not climate friendly things, whether that is how the roads are built. Some of the discussion point too is we've obviously seen an increase of natural disasters, whether it's a derecho in Iowa or hurricanes in the south or wildfires in the west. And so some of this money would actually be used being able to build structures and bridges that are more likely to be able to withstand that. And so that's, really when you start putting everything in the kitchen sink into a package, then you begin to wonder, well, how effective is it? And, I mentioned 621 billion for the transportation part, but the last time we had 5 years ago, we had a transportation bill. And that was, 305 billion over 5 years for the last 5-year highway bill. Now, granted, that was just a highway bill, but, I think there's a lot of people who are also remembering back when we had the financial collapse in 2008 and 2009 there. As President Obama came into office, we had all of these promises about shovel-ready money that was going to be put in. And so we're going to have this debate over whether it's really shovel-ready and whether it's needed and just throwing money at things, if that's really the right investment for the government to have, and how you move forward on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion. And I think, in some ways, this bill tries to echo back to the New Deal, if you will. And you mentioned like rural electrification and, there's the TVA and all the things that the government incentivized to try to help the country come out of the Depression. And many of those things benefited rural Americans. I won't say disproportionately, but it wasn't as though the utilities were going to electrify rural America without USDA investment and so on. And I think you see that with broadband as an example here. But your point's well made, and you wrote a great column about reconciliation, and there's this shadow of the $1.9 trillion COVID relief passage a month ago via reconciliation kind of hanging over this infrastructure. What are your observations there on, will we basically see this infrastructure bill go down the same path? It'll be an infrastructure deal that passes via reconciliation, and Republicans will sit on the sidelines, thumbing their nose at the administration as the bill passes anyway? Or is there any hope for some sort of bipartisan end to this chapter of the story?
Gosh, I wish I could say there's hope for bipartisanship, but everyone I keep talking to is not as hopeful. I always say nothing is the best package if it only has one party support. When we looked back at the first couple of years of Trump, we did have a Republican Congress, a Republican Senate, and Republican controlled White House. They used the reconciliation process once, which was to advance the tax reform. And even that, there was but the Affordable Care Act was another one that the Democrats have used the reconciliation process. The reconciliation process is interesting in the fact that it does not require that 60 vote minimum in the Senate to end debate or to prevent the filibuster, which just allows them to continue to talk about it. So a lot of times you have something called the cloture vote, which is 60 votes needed to end debate, and then you can proceed. So sometimes the final, some people will vote for cloture, but they won't actually vote in favor of a bill. So you could have, just a simple majority vote there. But when we hear about the 60 votes, but that required this special coordination in the Senate to bring some members across the aisle and work together. And so, it's kind of been used in a way in recent years to really make sure that one party just can't get all of their wish list, and it pushes bipartisanship. And I think that's really one of the most unfortunate things that we've seen since this administration came in. I listen in on call after call after call about the impact of this administration and what we can expect. And everybody last fall was really hopeful that because of these slim margins, we would see bipartisanship. So instead of being fearful of everything that could be coming down, there was this hope that we could see some working together. In the Senate, especially, if you have one or two members that decide to depart from the party, they can really get punished. We look back at what happened to Senator Feinstein, who was the then ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. And because she hugged the chairman, Republican, during the Supreme Court nominee, she lost her position as that ranking member, which would have now been the chairman, because flat out she hugged him. I mean, you get punished for how you vote within your party. And in the House, it's not quite so much because there's so many, but you really only have 8 or 10. Your margin in the House is so much slimmer. And in the Senate, it's 50-50. So as you look at this, you only need one Democrat to part ways and say, no, I can't get on board with this. And the fact that this infrastructure plan is being paid for, quote, paid for through tax cuts, you're going to start to see maybe some people who are going to say, I can't support that.
Tax hikes?
Right. So tax cuts, tax hikes, however you want to say them. Right. Tax cuts.
We're changing the corporate tax rate, in other words, right?
Right.
Is that my understanding?
Yes.
That we're going to raise the corporate tax rate. So in some ways, is that undoing the Trump tax cuts? I mean, that was his big signature piece of legislation early on, right? Was dropping corporate tax rates. Is this going and undoing that in a way to pay for this infrastructure and other items, Bill?
Right. So part of that is raising the capital gains rate from the current 21% to 28%, which is still not all the way as high as it had been, what they changed during the tax cuts during the Trump era. But we're already seeing West Virginia's senator having concerns about that. And so will that be the one Democrat vote? We have a lot of moderate members on both sides of the aisle. So you look at West Virginia Senator Manchin, and then also you've got Murkowski, you've got who's a Republican. You've got Senator Collins from Maine. Some of those members who don't always vote with their party. If nothing, we could maybe not see bipartisanship, but we could maybe see some people who say, I can't support this, so we've got to change it. And there's already been a letter out on some of that. It's not the capital gains tax, but it's actually how some smaller businesses were taxed in higher tax rate areas. So your East and West Coast. So some of those who have already said what's proposed, we could have concerns. So I mean, it's not a sure bet. I think we'll still see this debated within a couple of months here. But honestly, I am so sad if we again push through the reconciliation. And the Senate parliamentarian actually this week said we could have 3 reconciliation bills approved this year. And again, I just, as someone who watches policy, covers policy, has the thought that policy should be good policy, not based on politics. It worries me if we're going to try to ram 3 different packages through Congress solely based on party line votes. Because I just, at the end of the day, I don't think that that's probably what would best suit everybody. And you see all kinds of little things. When you've got a $2 trillion package, imagine all the pork that is in that. Yes, we've got some important things in there, but if you are unwilling to work across and kind of figure out ways of what's really good policy, it makes you wonder what, if it really is at the end of the day, good policy.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting echo in a lot of ways of the Obama administration's first term. I love the Bob Woodward book, The Price of Politics, and if folks haven't read that, I think it's worth going back and reading. Woodward kind of describes that period leading up to the passage of Obamacare, in a very similar kind of situation where they felt like they had to strike where the iron is hot. The Obama administration, that is, wanted to get this signature piece of legislation passed. Fairly partisan situation. You had the sort of Tea Party Freedom Caucus on the other side. Really interesting comparison to this, where if you're a political strategist in the White House, are you saying, hey, we have a really narrow window to pass stuff because after the midterms, Republicans aren't going to help us with anything anyway. So we've got to do what we can now because we're not going to be able to do anything later. Like, is that, if you're putting yourself in their shoes, what hope do you have that members of the House on the Republican side of the aisle are ever going to cross the aisle anyway? I hear you on the Senate, like that collegiality of the Senate is a thing that maybe they can hope to convince Murkowski or Romney or some of the other centrist Republicans to come on board with something. But the House is a much different kettle of fish, it feels like. Is that your read too?
Yes. And you always hear about the first 100 days of any administration, and we're about 2/3 through those 100 days. And so you start to see, well, what can we accomplish in this time? When you come out of the House, and one of my columns I wrote about some of these issues that they're looking to lump into this American Jobs Plan have bipartisan support, but you alienate those members who want to come together and support certain provisions, whether it's rural broadband or bridges and rural bridges, or even there's money in here for VA hospitals and expanding some of the funding for some of the health issues that some of the rural facilities are probably facing, but you alienate them by putting it all together. And so in immigration, the House actually a couple weeks ago did have a bipartisan farm labor solution, but the Senate has not taken it up. And then there's talk that they could try to put some of this immigration stuff within a reconciliation package too. So we have some of these issues that do have shared support and have actually gone, the Farm Workforce Act out of the House has a lot of legwork done on it, where both sides of Republicans and Democrats have really worked to find a compromise that they could support. And you actually had bipartisan support a wide bipartisan support from Republicans on a House measure. And even if you look at COVID, we had 6 trillion, another T, $6 trillion worth of COVID aid passed in 2020. Lot of bipartisan support, a lot of bipartisan support. So if that COVID package that we just passed earlier this year, why couldn't we have bipartisan support? Why is there this mentality that, it's my way or no way? And, I interviewed Representative Dusty Johnson from South Dakota earlier this week, a guy who's been known for his bipartisanship. He's not, he doesn't always vote with Republicans. He's often looking to work across party lines to introduce bills. And he said he and many others are so surprised because President Biden had a 40-year track record of working together. And, I even remember I was sitting in on one of the many calls after the elections, and it was a recording of Mitch McConnell in the Senate, who's now the minority leader, talking about Joe Biden before he left as vice president at the end of the Obama administration, and was talking about their friendship and how great of a guy he is. And, McConnell and Biden go way back. So why can't they put the hatchet down that seems to have been created here recently and really work together? It's a very different situation in the Senate that we have with this working together than we saw when Tom Daschle and Trent Lott had a very similar situation about 20 years ago. And really for all of America, that's unfortunate. Like, we really need to work together. We need to, like I said, put that hatchet down and figure out ways to come together. I'm just not seeing very much of that right now, which is really hard as a policy writer for rural America, because really at the end of the day, they're some of the ones that maybe don't fully understand all of these hidden things that are in some of these bills.
Yeah, and thanks for taking the time to explain a lot of it. And you mentioned your conversation with Representative Johnson. Would encourage folks to read your latest Inside Washington column, because it deals with legislators looking at some of the persistent port congestion issues. We'll save that topic for another time, but would encourage folks to go back and read that column. And Congressman Johnson gave you some great insight into what agriculture legislators are doing to look into that very important issue for those of us in the feed and grain industries. Jackie Fatka, thanks for joining us on Feedstuffs in Focus. You can read Jackie's latest Inside Washington column at feedstuffs.com, and you'll find it linked in the show notes of this episode. For the latest reporting on what's happening in the policy arena and how it affects livestock and animal feed production, visit our website, feedstuffs.com. Also, join us April 15th in our new virtual community and events platform, Feedstuffs 365, for a discussion about the proposed merger of the Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern Railways. I'll be joined by Max Fisher of the National Grain and Feed Association and Mike Steenhoek of the Soy Transportation Coalition to discuss what this proposed merger means for the feed industry, and I hope you'll join us for what promises to be an important conversation. I'm Andy Vance, and you've been listening to Feedstuffs in Focus. Thanks for joining us today. If you want to hear more conversations about some of the big issues affecting the livestock, poultry, grain, and feed industries, subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform, including Apple and Google Podcasts, or you can just check out our website, feedstuffs.com, for future episodes. Until next time, have a great day, and thanks for listening.